Thanks for joining me today. I think we will get started here. Some people will probably trickle in. Thanks for answering the polls. One website, someone said over 4 years old. That's getting a little old. We have some out there that are as that old. They're still pretty good, but it kind of depends. And one of the things we're going to hit on during this webinar is that with really good strategy, your website will last longer, right? It will actually provide a lot more value for many more years. So thanks for joining me. This is strategy and branding for website redesign. Redesigns. My name is Nicholas Longton. I'm senior strategist at Arcstone. So I've been working in the web and marketing since about the 90s, kind of the mid to late 90s. So a long time ago, before Google, social media, anything else. Web has changed quite a bit. I've actually done redesigns for the same website going back to the 90s. I think we're on the 7th or 8th version of some of these sites I've worked on. So in the last 15 years, I've been really focusing on content, storytelling, and marketing strategy. So I'll just cover quick the outline for this, and feel free if you want, introduce yourself in the chat. If you want, you can ask questions at any point during this webinar. Please use the Q&A panel. Feel free, this can be very interactive. Feel free to ask as many questions as you want. I may not stop in real time for everyone, but at the end of a section, I'll answer questions. So just the outline quick for this today. This is strategy and branding, and I've done other website redesign webinars that go more into detail into our process, but this one is really going to focus on strategy and branding and things you want to do before you kind of start all in on your redesign project. So the outline is going to be a section on strategy, all the strategy tools, documents, things you should have in place, and how to really maximize your strategy for your website redesign. Then content. Content is such a huge piece. We're going to have a section on content. Then we're going to cover an abbreviated overview of our process, all the individual steps. And it's going to relate back to how important that strategy was to these different steps. We'll talk just a little bit about testing and launching a new redesign, and we'll have dedicated time for Q&A at the end. Thanks for answering those polls. It looks like none of you have super new sites, so this is probably going to be very helpful for you. Keep in mind, you can always go to arcstone.com/events to rewatch this anytime, or the other webinars. I think this might be the 20th webinar, so there's quite a few on-demand content pieces there, webinars you can just watch as many times as you want. We have a large on-demand library. We'll take a bit of a break for the summer for these live ones and probably pick it back up in the fall. If you don't know who we are at all, Arcstone's a full-service digital agency. We've existed since 1997. We're in Minneapolis, and we do website design, development, ongoing marketing, content work, video, photography, blogging, hosting, and tech support for nonprofits and their websites, a whole host of things. Just some average clients of ours to give you an idea of who we work with. It's mostly nonprofits. This is National Mentoring Resource Center. We've done a few websites for them, a couple redesigns. That's a great organization. Children and Nature Network, a nonprofit with a phenomenal global footprint. Their website redesign we did about a year ago, I think won some awards. Hunger Solutions, another great local nonprofit helping people with food scarcity. These are just some examples of the typical clients we work with. So like I said, this webinar is a little bit different than the other redesign ones. There's more of a focus on strategy. So why strategy? Why do we want to really focus on the strategy involved with executing a great redesign project? So typically people get excited about the design phase and the colors and the design and content and all this fun stuff, and really getting into building the site. It's a lot. That's the fun part. The strategy maybe is not as fun. Sometimes we see organizations really skip over some critical strategy steps. They'll get their site built, right? And then they'll say, yeah, we're going to do some blogs this year. We should do some marketing personas for those. And it's like, well, you should have probably done those before the site was redesigned, right? Because that informs a lot of the process. And there's a lot of other sort of strategy steps that may get skipped or glossed over that really make a big impact during your redesign project. So having a very solid strategy does a lot of things for you. It's going to help you conserve your budget and really prioritize things. It's going to make sure that you can get the most out of your budget, stay on time, meet the deadlines. If you have a deadline of when you want it to launch or when you want certain things done, having the strategy all done is going to help with that. It's going to help you avoid some major mistakes. For instance, not having enough content for a specific audience, or not having CTAs for a specific group, or you're going to have, say, a capital campaign or some kind of campaign running and you don't have the right content on the site to support it. All of these things. And it's going to add a lot of longevity to your site. As many times I'll have a client come to me and their site's only a year old or maybe 2 years old and they want to do a redesign. And I'm thinking, this site should have lasted a lot longer than a year or two. What went wrong? And many times it's they didn't do the strategy, right? Oh, the new site's done, but we have a new brand. It doesn't reflect that. Or we have a tweak to our mission, or we have a new persona. The site isn't inclusive of those things. That's a sign maybe the strategy wasn't done early enough. So it's going to make for a site that lasts longer, which is always great, right? And it's going to make for a much more effective website. The goals that you have organizationally and how your website fits into that and helps you meet those goals, it's going to be much more effective for meeting those goals. And continuity with ongoing marketing efforts and supporting that, right? You don't just build a site and then never touch it again. You build a site and you put your news up there. You try to get donations, newsletter subscribers, you do blogging, all these different things and ongoing communications, right? To grow your mission and grow your organization. And if you have very solid strategy for the site and are thinking about that from the get-go, the website's going to support all of those efforts much, much, much better. So let's get into the first big chunk of strategy. And these are basically the main components for the redesign strategy components. So these are kind of the big buckets we're going to talk about first, which is your brand and style, your audience and content, and what are the goals and what are the calls to action and the interactive components that are going to support those goals. These are kind of the three first big buckets. And we're going to go first into brand and style here and talk about this. So your brand and style is made up a lot of different components. Of course, the visual style, but also the voice and how your brand sounds. So when it comes to the visual style and the visual representation of your brand, you have things like your logo, your sort of official color palette, but also how you use imagery. Do you use photography? Do you use illustrations? How do you combine those components? Do you have different colors that represent different things? Do you have themes to your imagery and all of these types of things? And sort of establishing this first as part of your strategy. How do you want to visually represent your brand? This is a very, very valuable thing for a redesign project. So many times, a brand, you may have a brand guide, which is very simple. This is what our logo looks like. These are the different, variations of it, the monochrome, the color, this, that. You probably have an official color palette. I would even extend that in the strategy step and develop. Sometimes we call them style tiles, or we call them, digital style guides, where you take those things, you take the logo, the imagery, the photos, illustrations, colors, even text and your fonts, and you kind of combine them all into this guide, which will help with developing and styling your site. So this is helpful even before the sort of the design stage, right? Where you go into actually laying out and designing your site. This is just going to make sure that your brand and the design of the new site's really on brand and your brand is represented well. And I need to talk a little bit about color too, because we're going to talk about visual cues, how color affects things, how visual design cues help users understand content, but also in the mindset of inclusivity and accessibility. And this is a thing I've run into a lot. And it's very important to strategically use your colors, your brand colors. So many times what happens is brand colors, especially in the nonprofit world, which may have softer palettes or, not as contrasty palettes, maybe, more kind of nuanced. Many times your official brand colors, they may not be able to meet accessibility standards. For instance, you may want to use a brand color as a background with some white text, not enough contrast. so you won't meet, accessibility standards. So brand colors usually are best used for sort of accents. Um, so if your brand palette doesn't have neutrals or it doesn't have enough contrast, you're going to probably have to consider expanding your palette a bit. And of course, not every single visual piece has to, meet accessibility standards. You can have design elements and different things that don't necessarily need to have a certain level of contrast. You can use your brand colors for those. But anything that's critical to the understanding or function of your site, those need to meet, of course, accessibility standards. So that's a big thing I've seen a lot of nonprofits struggle with, is they kind of come up with how they want to use their brand colors in their site, and it causes accessibility problems. So one thing you can do is you can use tools like this WebAIM, a contrast checker, to measure the contrast and make sure that if you want to use these colors in combination, that they will meet accessibility standards. I would also say this, that I highly recommend, and we're seeing this more common, I highly recommend you bake accessibility into your style guide. Meaning if you have an older style guide or have one that doesn't mention accessibility at all, to put that in there. So maybe take a look at your style guide and where it talks about fonts and colors and text, and make sure there is instructions in there for designers and developers on how to use those colors, and have the contrast numbers in there so people understand what they can use and what combination to still stay within accessibility guidelines. So that's a big part of planning your brand, how it's represented visually, and the strategy around that. Another thing related to your brand is the voice. How does it sound? How does your organization sound? How does it speak? This is sort of your communication style, and it has to do with the tone, the type of language you use. Is it more formal? Is it more informal? Is it serious? Is it playful? How are you trying to communicate? Is it to entertain, to engage, inform, to advocate, to educate? There's these different sort of purposes to the language. And then there's also technical details, which have more of an impact really on SEO. But there's technical details like how is your name abbreviated? How is it written? You want to always use your name in written language the same way. This actually helps Google connect the dots between all of your online content. The same with your phone number. Your phone number should always be written the same way. If you use dots or dashes or whatever, the one in front of the area code, your address as well, how your address is used. Is avenue spelled out? Is it abbreviated? Those things seem trivial, but they actually matter a lot, especially for localized SEO. Having extreme consistency between those technical details helps. And this little picture here is part of a workbook. And I'm going to show you more pieces of this workbook. It's called our Communications Toolkit. And it's a strategy workbook and guide with different things in it and exercises to help you with this strategy work before redesign. That's going to be all emailed to you, and you can download it and use it as much as you want. That will be in the email that follows this webinar. So look for that. I'm going to show throughout the webinar a bunch of pages from this. And this is the one, this is a strategy activity from it on brand, style, and voice. And you can see a little bit of what it has here, but there's multiple pages. And this, if you have no framework at all, this is a really good way to help dial in that brand voice. I'm going to switch the poll here. Thanks for answering that polls or those polls. Here's another one about style guides. So again, if you have an older style guide, maybe update it, maybe look at this workbook and grab some ideas from it. And definitely, I highly recommend you look at your brand guide and think about accessibility. So the next major piece, strategy work, is going to be your audience. This is really important. And this is whenever we embark on a redesign project and the client does not have established personas or has really old ones or hasn't even thought about it, I'm always, whoa, let's pump the brakes. Because dialing in your audience and your personas is so important to everything, to how the site looks, how it functions, the design, the content, the calls to action, kind of everything, right? So I always say, if you're trying to speak to everyone, you're really speaking to no one. You need to dial in the strategy stages of your redesign, the audience and how you're going to engage with them. So a big step of the audience is identifying what are the key personas. And a persona is basically a fictional person we make up, which talks a little story about who they are, their life, how they interact with your brand and organization. What are the other adjacent organizations they work with? What motivates these people? What are they looking from you? What are their main challenges? What are their motivators, habits, online digital habits? All of this stuff is really contained in a persona, and it's very, very valuable. I can't stress that enough. What we try to do is we try to base these on actual real people. So say you want to have a donor persona and a participant persona, a volunteer persona. We'll say, okay, if you want to develop a donor persona, who is a phenomenal donor that you just love, that's contributed year after year, that's an advocate for you, that's a real ambassador? Who is that ideal donor? And we will actually base the fictional persona partly on the real person. And that is very valuable. So these can be one page like that's shown here. Each persona is just one simple page. They can be that, and you can start small and start with just one and start with one maybe main donor persona. And as you branch out and you realize, we have two big motivators. We have donors that used to use services like we have, and they're passionate about the cause. We have, other donors who have a different motivation. Maybe that donor persona splits into two. So you can always do that. You can start small. Many times, if you're engaging with us for persona work, we'll develop multi-page personas that could be, 10 to 20 pages long that go very into detail with fictional quotes from the person, a breakdown of the digital habits of their personal profile and motivators, and a whole background thing, and sort of the engagement profile. How do they engage with you over time? How do they discover you? What turns them from, knowing about you to donating, to advocating, and all those different steps. So the persona work, we do a lot of that, and it's very, very valuable. It's an incredibly important strategic step to any redesign project. So it looks like only 17% of you said you have established style guides. A lot of you said you have one, but nobody uses it, which is actually common. Unfortunately, that's kind of common. So I would recommend to get people to use your style guide, make it as encompassing as possible, review it once a year, update it once a year, keep it in front of people. So thank you for those polls. So let's talk a little bit about the next major step, which is evaluating your current site. So we're talking about redesigns here. We are assuming you have a site and you're redesigning it. And there is a lot of good information you can get from your current site. Maybe even if your current site's maybe not a great performer for your organization, it's not driving a lot of donations or actions, there's still things you can learn from it. For sure, you want to review it before you start a redesign. Of course, to not repeat the same mistakes and improve things and leverage what's working, right? There's probably something already working on your site. The first big step to evaluating your current site is really looking at your analytics. And it's probably Google Analytics or maybe another tool. There's many analytics tools. I'm sure all of you have Google Analytics. So you're going to want to pay attention to, especially in your analytics, what are your top pages and top content? What is the content people are spending a lot of time on? What is it resonating? That's who is it resonating with? And the events and goals in your site. Hopefully in analytics, you're tracking some custom events, some goals, maybe donation button clicks or some kind of conversion. Hopefully you're tracking that stuff. Pay attention to the content people have looked at when they did those actions. Pay attention to where they're coming from, which is called, user acquisition. Where are they coming from? Are we getting more donations from certain social channels versus other? Is our organic search really low? How are people finding us? Is it mostly branded words? Are they searching for our organization instead of what we do? All of these things are an important strategic step. And a lot of times to let you know two things: how to change the structure of your site. Does the structure need to be improved? And the content. What content is working now that we want to keep, right? If you have a section of your site doing really well, driving a lot of organic traffic, you probably don't want to monkey with it too much. You probably want to keep it somewhat similar if it's performing, right? But of course, add and improve. So looking at your analytics is a very big step to the planning process. And for redesigns where you're really going to change the look and the feel, I highly also recommend a UX review. And this is something that isn't super common. Like I've run across very few clients who have done this before or even asked for it or suggested it. But this is a big deal. The UX review is sort of goes beyond analytics. So all analytics can tell you is what people loaded on from your site, what pages they saw, how many pages they went to, the time they spent, where they went. But a UX review tracks more than just when pages are loaded. It tracks the scrolling. It tracks clicks, even if it's a click on something that doesn't go anywhere. It tracks interactions. What are people doing on the site? So this is really helpful for a redesign because it's going to show you if you have some UX issues now. Are people clicking on things that aren't actionable? Are they, what parts of the site are they using a lot? Where are they scrolling to and spending time on? So this is a UX review tool we use a lot called Crazy Egg. There's many of them. So this is showing a heat map and scroll map and all the clicks and user interactions. And you can see it's broken down by like a mobile view on the right and the desktop view on the left. And that's another thing. This will show you the difference between how people use things on mobile versus desktop. And if you haven't really paid attention to mobile yet, you really do need to, because that is huge for Google, for the visibility of your site online. And mobile traffic just keeps becoming more and more of the overall mix of traffic. So a UX review, I highly recommend if you can do it. We basically own the tools to do it in every redesign project with us. This is a step we pretty much always take. And you can even take it a bit further if you want. And you can use a tool like Hotjar or some other tool to solicit feedback on your actual current site. If you've got areas that people go to find information, you can have a quick little thing, thumbs up, thumb down, was this useful, or rate this page's content from 1 to 5. You can conduct polls and surveys through Hotjar, do screen recordings to see a session where people are clicking, what they're doing. So this is even another step which you can do. If you've got 6 months or a year before you're starting, you want to gather feedback. Tools like this can be really helpful. Another part of sort of the strategy is really looking more globally, organizationally. What are the objectives? If this isn't really nailed down, what you want your website to do for you, your redesign project is probably not going to be as successful. So really looking at our organization overall, what are our goals? What do we want the website to do? Where does it fit in? And this is kind of 3 big categories. Is really your mission and your services. Have you added a new service since your last website was designed? Is there a tweak to your mission? Are you approaching something differently? Are the things that are the top priorities in your current site still the top priorities? Or do you need to refresh that? And then how are you fitting into the market? And even if you're a nonprofit, you're not selling anything, there's probably other nonprofits doing the same thing or similar. So how do you fit into that whole marketplace? And competitors, meaning, someone is having an issue with food scarcity and they're looking at different food banks or different services, right? Where do you fit in with that? What is your positioning? What is your secret sauce? What do you do better than these other ones or differently? And then goals. What were the goals for the past website? Were you trying to get donations on your site? You wanted it to be a source of donations that wasn't happening. Did you have the right conversion opportunities, CTAs in place? Looking at all those kinds of things. So these are more important sort of global things to look at. And they relate to your goals, that third strategy component, your goals and your calls to action. And we find if you want your website to do something for you, if you want your website to really drive action, it is really important in the strategy step to really be strategic and plan out how are calls to action going to work. How is the site supposed to drive action? And if you have certain actions and goals you want the site to do, you have to make sure the design supports it, the calls to action are in place, the content around it supports it. So this is just an example from a redesign project from Emma Norton. It's just a small piece of the page, not the whole page. But they have in the footer of every page a fund a need area. So instead of just asking blanket for donations, they're telling you right here what dollar amounts do what. For $100, every kid that month will get a birthday party. So it's really showing the impact. And this is their CTA strategy, is to tie the dollars to the impact. And they always have some piece of content that's a really quick overview that's 30 seconds, whether it's video or written, near these things. So if you're new, you want to really see what they do, you can quickly understand what the organization does, why they're special, why they have this need, and then the dollar amounts and what they actually do for people. So it's very cool. It's a very cool way of strategically implementing CTAs to have the site drive action. And this redesigned site does drive a lot more donations from their previous site and a lot more from out of state, which was a very interesting thing that happened with COVID. And they started paying a lot more attention to online and doing less in-person things, more online content. It all actually helped their site drive a lot more donations. So that's kind of the big three components for your strategy planning, your branding and stuff. And we're going to talk more now about content specifically, because this is a huge thing. Really, that's what people are coming to your site for, is for the content. They're not really coming for the design or the look or any of that. They're coming for the content. I'm going to switch this poll here. Thank you very much for the polls. It kind of helps guide this conversation. So here's one about UX studies. Just, I'm curious if any of you have done a UX study. So content planning, this is a big part, of course, of a redesign. Oh, it looks like so far no one has said they've done a UX study, which is kind of what I found, right? That's kind of typical. So for sure, reach out to me if you're interested. After this, you have my email if you're interested in what a UX study really is. So let's talk about content. So the number one mistake people make with a redesign, and this is kind of, skipping over the strategy of this content part, right, is copying and pasting from your old site. Even if the design elements maybe aren't drastically different, you really don't want to simply copy and paste from your old site. You may be retaining some content, big chunks of content, but more than likely, things need to shift around. They're going to be a little different. And you really do want to plan out and be strategic about the content. So you're going to look, of course, at your current items, and of course, pay attention to your current content with, connecting that with the analytics. How is it actually performing, right? Another thing is if you have any premium content, say you have an ebook people can download or a guide to something or whatever. If you have some of that premium content that's a download, maybe it's a PDF, maybe that old PDF matched the old site and kind of looked, like it was from there, it was related. But now you're changing your whole site design. So you may need to go back and evaluate that premium content and update it. Don't forget about that. Also, graphics and photos. Are your staff and your leadership pictures 10 years old? You might want to consider new pictures, right? So going through your current content assets and seeing what can be retained, what needs to be updated, that is a very important step. And it is very helpful if you can to use some type of content planning tool. This tool here is called Gather Content. It's just a quick example of something. And Gather Content is actually quite good, and I found it very useful. That is one I would look at if you're going to have a lot of content on your site, especially when you get to over 50 pages. You start talking about hundreds of pages. It is really nice to use a tool. I recommend Gather Content. Now, if you don't want to spend a ton of money or don't want to do a tool, if you are highly organized and highly disciplined, you can just use something like Google Drive. So this was a Google Drive system I created, which was for a redesign project. And the design sort of language that this client used had all these icons, and they had very specific colors for certain programs. This comes back to, right, the branding and planning out the colors. They have three programs, each represented by a distinct color and distinct icons. So we were very disciplined on how we implemented that content and those colors and those icons. So we did it in Google Drive, which is okay if you're very organized and disciplined about it. So it looks like 0 of you said you've done a UX study. Okay, that's very interesting. So another thing about content is we talked about the personas and all that kind of stuff. So when you start to create the new content for the new site, the worst thing you can do is have phenomenal personas and never look at them. Look at your personas, your brand voice guide, all of those things. Heavily rely on those for your content. And this is especially important for nonprofits because you may kind of have different staff members doing different things. You may be working with someone like me, or you have contract writers or using writers from Upwork, the more people involved with the content, the more likely it is that content seems different, that different pieces sound different, and one's very on brand, maybe one is off brand. So having the good branding documents, the persona documents, having everyone work off of those will make everything more consistent. So it will align the content with your personas and goals much better. And don't wait till you've started to design to work on content. And we're going to show why that's important soon. But content, having some content ready before you even start on the design is incredibly important. And I'm going to talk about that very soon and show you some examples of what I mean. I'm going to switch the poll here again. I think there's about 9 of them. So let's talk about a worksheet, some worksheets. Again, I mentioned I'm going to be sending you this communications toolkit. So the toolkit has a bunch of worksheets for planning the content, like what I'm talking about. So there's a page brief. This is one of the worksheets based on sort of page content. So page brief will help you make sure you have a primary message, a second message. It will help you dial in the value for the page. Value and action, meaning if a user spends a minute on this page reading the content, what's the value they get? What is the action you want them to take? And this will also help you dial in some of the SEO stuff too. And we also have a dedicated SEO worksheet for each page. So if you want to be really strategic about your content, your website content, these are 2 sets of worksheets that are really good to make sure you have the strategy in place for every page of content you're doing. It's really important for SEO. People forget about that. I'll have clients say, we want to rank for this. Why aren't we ranking? And I will look at the page and the keywords they want to rank for are literally not even in the page. So, I mean, at the very, very basic, when it comes to content, if you want to rank for certain words, that has to be in your content. It should be in the title, the meta title, the meta description, the H1 on the page, and the body content, whatever keyword. And this is kind of a thing I see with nonprofits too. They make their page H1s maybe not descriptive enough. It'll say something like, empowering children or this or that, or some kind of more generic global catchphrase, which is not detailed enough for search engines, right? You need to be specific. So now we've kind of covered most of the big strategy components. The ones that I see nonprofits kind of skimping on and maybe skipping over a little bit and not having exactly dialed in, which affects their redesign process. So I'm going to go into how those relate to each step of the redesign process. And I'm going to go through kind of all the major steps. So I'm going to go through the platform, how to choose the platform, what is your site built on? Then we're going to talk about site mapping. Then we're going to talk about the planning, the integrations and interactivity. Then the wireframing step, the mock-up step, the development step, and then testing and launching. Those are kind of all the major steps and stages in a redesign project. So it looks like most of you are, 60% are right now planning for a redesign. So that's good. Hopefully this is very helpful to you. Switch the poll again here. I'm going to ask about content planning tools. The content planning tools are becoming more common now. So the first major step in the redesign process is, what is the website going to be built on, right? CMS, meaning content management system. What platform? So I would consider your organization requirements, right? What do you require as an organization? Do you need your staff to be able to update the site? Any part of the site, homepage text, blogs, newsletters, whatever, the donation page, to be able to add different donation options. What do you need to do? What do you plan on outsourcing? Most nonprofits, because, you have, restrictions on budgets and other things, you really do need to control your entire site to be able to do anything on it, edit any piece. So consider your requirements, consider how are you going to collect donations? Are you going to collect it on the site? Do you have a third-party system? What other third-party tools does it have to integrate with? Do you have a sort of a system for collecting contacts? Do you have a contact management system, email newsletter system? Do you have a donation platform where you keep information on donors? What does this have to integrate with? And then for sure, avoid anything that is not supported well by a large community of third-party people, just in case something happens. You're working with a vendor and it's great and they build your site, but then they disappear, which has happened to, unfortunately, many of my clients. So if that vendor disappears and the platform you used isn't well known or it was proprietary, you could be in serious trouble. And pay attention to, is the platform currently supported? For instance, Drupal ended up end of lifing, discontinuing a couple major versions of their platform, which like millions of websites were using. And that is very dangerous to be on a platform that's outdated. That means there's no more security support for it. There's no new updates coming out or anything. So the platform is the first major consideration. Then we're going to talk about the sitemap. The sitemap is the next stage. This is a visual map, an organizational structure of every page on your website, and usually different features and elements of the main navigation too, and where things link off to other sites, or where calls to action are, or forms or embedded content. So you can see this sitemap has a little ledge in there. We make a little key, a little guide, so people can look at the sitemap and really understand it well. So we talked about personas and that strategy work. These two strategy pieces are really tied together. The sitemap is the first major strategy thing that is about the organization of your site, and it has to tie back very closely to the audience, right? Every audience that you have for your site, donor, volunteer, or participant in your program, whatever, those need to have pathways represented in your sitemap. And if you want people to come to your site and do an action, if you want your site to drive action, the sitemap's really important. You need to make sure you have the right number of pages to support the different types of content, the different types of audiences, and that there's logical linking from page to page and section to section to bring those audience peoples through a certain pathway to encourage them to take actions. So this is also helpful for planning the subnav, how the subsections are going to work. And don't forget about site search. How is your site going to be searched? It's funny because ideally your site is so intuitive, nobody needs to search it with a keyword, right? But this is very important to Google. Site search on your site, having a search box on every page, easily accessible and good search results, is actually something Google is now paying attention to. So that's quite important. Looks like 0% said you have a content planning tool. That's actually been kind of quite common. So unfortunately, a lot of them cost money, but they are useful. I'm gonna switch the poll here again. So the next thing is the integrations. We talked a little bit about that in the platform, making sure your platform supports the integrations. Now, I will say this, a redesign is the perfect time to look at your integrations. How do you want to change it? Do you have a calendar system, event system, donation system, or social media interactions, whatever? I'm showing you a picture here of a client, MindBody Solutions. We redesigned their site. They ended up bringing the donation platform in-house, part of the site. You don't need to leave it anymore. They ended up bringing the calendar and event system inside the site. They don't need to use third-party systems anymore. So you may think that you need to rely on Eventbrite or some third-party thing now, but when you go through a redesign, it's very likely that we can bring that into your site, not have to have people leave the site, and make it a lot more intuitive for users. So it looks like most of you said you're not sure about platform yet, but almost the majority have said WordPress, which is pretty common. WordPress has pretty much become the de facto standard now for nonprofit sites, and I highly, highly recommend WordPress. That is what we use. So interactivity, this is another thing you want to do in the planning stage. You want to plan this out. What is the form tool you're going to use? Where are you going to have forms? How are you going to collect that data? How are you going to have CTAs that drive people to those forms to collect data? Are you going to use pop-ups? Are you going to have chat or other interactive features? And consider the accessibilities of these. You may have a chat thing you really like, or you may have a pop-up system you really like, but they're not accessible. So vet any third-party system or plugin or tool you're going to use for accessibility before you decide on it, right? And then another thing when you get into sort of designing is, if you know you're going to use these other third-party tools, pay attention to, can you change the look of them? Can you tweak the settings of these tools and make them really match your new redesign? That's another important step. So the next step, kind of once you've figured out your sitemap, you have a visual representation, the hierarchy of your site. You know what's going to be in the main navigation, the sub navigation, you know the third-party tools you're using, the interactive tools you're using. Now it's the wireframes. Now the wireframe is when you really start to lay out and figure out how our page is going to look. What are we going to have in the home page, the about page, the contact page, those different pages. So this is a skeleton. There's very little design. These are usually monochrome, no colors. And this is a step where having content already written is very important. Now, we're not even into really design yet in colors, but already we want some content. And I'll show you why. And this step is where you define those unique layouts. So you can see here, here's some wireframes for a nonprofit. And this is real content. This is the real content they wrote. And this is helpful. Now we know how much space do we have to put different content in. We're going to have these three major areas for their three audiences. They define that in the sitemap. Then it comes to the wireframe, content through design. They are doing a very good job through this strategic planning phase. You'll see as you know, representing the different audiences. So having the content ready to be able to put real content in there is super useful. And you'll see this page has a little bit of Latin. There's a tiny bit of Latin just because they know we need a paragraph here. This is how much space we're going to have. We don't have it quite written yet. But we've got the H1 written, the calls to action written, these buttons written. We know where the chat's going to go. We know where the H2 is going to go to. We know what's going to be linked in the content. So they've already had that content ready that is incredibly valuable in this wireframe stage. And you know, interactivity too. This is a pop-up. That's really important. This is one of the main functional pieces of their site. And we're focusing on the functionality before the design. We're paying special attention to inclusivity too, and challenging any biases or assumptions about how something should function. You know, we're breaking things down to make sure that you know, all the audiences that we need to serve are going to be represented and understand how these functions work. So wireframes are great for focusing on the user. How's the user going to actually use the site, ingest the content, see different things, interact with the calls to action. Basically, wireframes are a huge step in helping your visitors get what they need easily. The easier your redesigned site is for people to use, the more effective it is overall. Here's another wireframe we did, which was a very complicated piece. It's kind of the main guts of the site, the main place people go to use the functional piece of the site. Thank you for the polls there. I'll switch it again. I think I've got another one coming up here. All right, switch that poll. Not many left. So once the wireframe is all done, you've wireframed out your unique pages and different layouts, and you've got the blocks there. Then it comes to actually designing the site. This is the fun part where a lot of people get really excited, you know. So this is the mock-ups, and mock-ups are high fidelity, full color representations of what the actual page is going to look like. So now the number one problem we find with design is trying to over design, trying to have a whole bunch of design elements in there just to kind of make things not seem plain or unique, you know, make things look unique or something. But you know, the best design sites, you know, the design is actually kind of minimal, and each design element is really very functional and has a purpose behind it. So the design stage is fun, and we're not going to do a mock-up of every single page, right? That just wouldn't be time efficient or budget efficient. But what we're going to do is we're going to mock up the major pages. For sure, the home page, and then at least one interior content page, and kind of a few other pages, right? So we're going to do full mock-ups, and when we go to development and these mock-ups are turned into an actual functioning website, they will look exactly like this. And if you've ever seen that happen where you get a design, but it looks different once it's in your browser, that's a sign that maybe something went wrong in the development, and maybe the developers and designers are not really communicating well enough. What we do is it's all in-house, and sometimes it's actually the same person. You know, we have what they call full stack developers. Well, they can go from sitemap to wireframe to design to development. They can kind of do it all, which does build in some efficiencies. And you want to mock up how video is going to look, photography. If possible, use real photos for your designs, real photos of real people, real participants, real donors, like whatever. Use real photos. If you can, avoid using stock photos. And then we kind of get into the developments. So that's where we're going to take the mock-up and turn it into a functioning website that is going to be handed off to developers and actually, built into WordPress, right? So here's my top tips for development. Likely you're not going to be doing any of this. It's very unlikely you have any actual sort of web developers on staff. Maybe you do have some designers that participate in design. You probably are going to handle some writing, communication stuff, but it's very unlikely you're going to have any tech people. So choose an expert in the platform. Whatever you do, whatever platform you're doing, if it's Wix or Drupal or WordPress, hopefully it's WordPress. Make sure whoever's developing your site has done like hundreds of them, right? If you go to a developer and they're like, oh yeah, WordPress sounds good. Okay, we've done maybe 1 or 2 WordPress sites. We'll learn this. You don't want on the job learning for your redesign project. You're going to miss deadlines and go over budget and stuff. So choose an absolute expert in the platform, someone that's done like hundreds of the sites in that platform. Make sure you can support the final site. Like I said, make sure the developer understands what you need to control. I've had nonprofits come to us and ask for a website redesign purely because they can't control the site. There's a big chunk on the homepage or a video gallery or slideshow, and the developer hard-coded everything. There's no way for them to update it, which is a huge bummer. Sometimes the sites look really nice. The client just can't edit any of it. So make sure the developer knows how you need to use the site, what you need to control. And in the development stage, test the site performance. Is it fast? Does it load really fast? Is there good accessibility? Is SEO represented? Is the SEO stuff dialed in? Do you have H1s, H2s? Is the page structure, how it was built, laid out? Are all the major SEO little elements in place? Can you control the things like the title and the meta description? So I asked to pull about accessibility testing. It looks like none of you yet have done accessibility testing. Well, that's something I would highly encourage. And actually in the follow-up email to this, there's going to be links to more information about accessibility and kind of what that entails. And if you wanted to get a review or audit done, some information for that. So that is kind of the development stage. Those are the really key things you need to pay attention to. There's a lot that happens behind the scenes. And of course, your developer has a lot of work from turning it into a design to a functioning site. So let's talk a little bit about testing and launching the site. This is important. Of course, you don't want to launch a website and have some kind of issue with it. There's also some major SEO considerations whenever you do a redesign. So we're going to talk about those, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. We'll have maybe 5 to 10 minutes of dedicated Q&A time. If anyone has questions, feel free anytime, put in questions, please. So the testing approach. So you for sure want to test for your target browsers. Of course, you're not going to be going way back in time to like Internet Explorer 7 or something, but look at your analytics, see what are the browsers, what are the devices people are coming to our site on. If 75% of your traffic is mobile, you better make sure you've tested your site for mobile and it works really well. Test the responsiveness. That means the different types of screen sizes, what is technically called viewport. So a desktop computer versus a tablet versus a phone all have dramatically different aspect ratios. And now what we do is we don't develop different versions for each thing. What we have, what's called responsive programming. So that site responds to the device and automatically, looks good. So test that for sure. And it's basically almost impossible to do good, thorough testing without some kind of tool. So hopefully your developer has a tool, or you can get some kind of tool, because the amount of testing to make sure everything works kind of perfectly is quite a bit. So we use something called Sauce Labs. That's our personal tool that we use in all of our redesign projects. So Sauce Labs is sort of a virtual online computer where we can say, give me a 15-inch laptop with Edge 7 and IE 10 and Chrome 70 on it or whatever, and I want this screen resolution. We can literally launch a virtual computer and literally use the site, click around and make sure it works. So that's a lot better. Some tools, probably the ones you would have access to for cheap or free, just kind of pull up what it looks like, but you can't click around. In different browsers, the functionality can be different. If some mistake was made in development, you can catch it with these tools. And for sure, check the performance of your site. The speed of the site and desktop and mobile has a huge impact on your SEO and how visible Google is going to make your site in the search engines. Google does not want to send visitors and searchers in their search engines to sites that are slow and don't work well. So before it launches, test the speed. A thing that I've seen happen is people will have an old kind of plain site. Maybe they didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have a budget. Now they have a much bigger budget. They want a real beautiful graphical design site that's really cool looking. Those can, if they're not developed right, can be incredibly slow. They can look nice, but take forever to load, and that will severely harm their SEO performance of your site. So this is a free tool from Google called Page Speed Insights. This is a redesign we did. And as you see, the homepage is scoring 93, which is amazing. It goes from 0 to 100. So if you're in the 90s for desktop and, in the 70s or higher for mobile, that's phenomenal. You have no issues. Accessibility, we talked a little bit about that. For sure, before your site launches, test it for accessibility. This is that same website I just showed you, and we run it through the Wave tool. This is a tool that we use for our accessibility audits and testing. As you can see, their homepage has 0 accessibility errors and 0 contrast errors. And the rest of those things are just different features and alerts and things to pay attention to just to double check, but there's no issues. So very fast website, 0 accessibility issues. That's what you want when you launch your redesign. Another thing with testing and launching, there are some SEO considerations. So Google has been crawling your old site. Google understands your old site well. All of a sudden you launch a completely new one. You don't want to confuse Google. You want to make sure Google understands how to also crawl the new site. And you also want to make sure incoming links you may have in your ads, links you may have in social media posts, paid links from other websites, all of those links, if those pages or content have moved around, you need to redirect those old links, which you're not going to go out and change every old link on the internet, to reflect some new place. So you have to put in 301 redirects. That's a big part of our Q&A when we launch a redesign, is making sure that any old link or anything out there will come to the site and find its way to the new location. This can also highly impact your SEO and your Google performance. If Google hits your site and your sitemap file's old, or there's all these other links leading to your site and they all 404, the more errors you have on your site, the more crawl errors, that impacts your SEO. Let's switch poll here quick. So yeah, it looks like 0% of you have done an accessibility audit. So look for that email. It's going to have information in there about it. So you want to do that. You want to review your metadata. That's the meta title, meta description. So that's code behind the scenes a user doesn't see. That's not the title on the page users see, it's behind the scenes. And that is what Google reads. And if they're done well, that is what you will see in a search engine. The link and the little piece of text, for each search result, that is controlled by the metadata. And if you do it right, Google will use your metadata, and that can be incredibly powerful for making sure people, when they see you in a search engine, they click through and visit your site. So you want to do a final audit of all that SEO stuff for sure before you launch. So that's kind of the strategy and each step and how the strategy relates to a website redesign. So that's all the content I have prepared. I definitely have time for questions. It looks like I'm looking at some of your poll results for when you want a new site. It looks like 50% of you want a site by the end of the year. Okay, so just knowing about timelines, of course, I don't know how big your site is going to be, but based on sort of average timelines, I would suggest you absolutely be in this planning stage right now. If you want a new site by the end of the year, and your site's going to have, into the hundreds of pages, you probably definitely want to settle on a vendor, hopefully in the next month. I would say, by the end of summer, by like July, August, hopefully you have the strategy work in place, some of it, and have a vendor kind of picked or a few narrowed down. Because typically the fall and the end of the year gets very busy. So if you can do things during the summer now, that's good. That persona work, that research work, branding, style, voice guide, that kind of stuff. for sure. So I have time now. I have 4 minutes for questions. If anyone has a question, comment, anything you want to put in the chat there or the Q&A panel. I think I've done for sure into the hundreds of websites. So about 25 years of redesigning sites and hundreds of them. So pretty much any question you have, I could probably answer. So I'll hang on here for another 3 to 5 minutes and see if there's any questions. And thank you so much for joining me today. I know everyone's getting sick of webinars and this and that. Now, if you missed any part of this webinar, it will be available on demand. You don't have to register again. So make sure you see that email. The email will get to you Tuesday. Tuesday, you'll get the email on-demand version of this, links to all the things I showed you, links to the strategy and toolkits and stuff you can just download and use for free. How much does a redesign cost? If you have 50 pages. So 50 pages is fairly small. That's fairly small. It kind of depends, the platform, other things, how much are you going to do, how much you need your vendor to do. So it depends, but generally I would say, if you want a website that is going to be in the upper tier of your sort of industry, you're looking at 10,000 plus, really, if you want it to be something that's custom. Custom meaning it's a design made for you. You can lower the cost of stuff like Wix sites, WordPress sites. You can lower that by using a pre-built design that someone else already did. And sometimes that's not the end of the world. You can tweak those, but generally you're talking 10 plus for sites that are actually made kind of from scratch, more or less, right? Even for a small site like that, but it depends upon a lot of things. There's a lot of variables. I would say this is a thing that is a big factor, especially with nonprofit websites that trip up people, cause an issue with budget, which is content. So pay a special attention to budgeting for doing the content and having good content. I would say that almost 80% of the redesign projects, the client has underestimated the effort for content. That is one of the big areas people try to kind of save on the budget. I'll have a client, they'll say, we need you to do a great design, custom design, build the site. We need a lot of functionality. We are going to handle all of the content. We've got the content, right? And then they get down to doing it and they just keep missing their deadlines for content. They have a hard time. It's just content takes a lot more time than clients think. So I would say people under budget for that. And of course, the content is critical. I mean, it's super critical. Like I said, people are coming to your site for the content, and the content is what makes you show up in search engines. It's how you get organic visibility, which is the best kind of traffic. Organic users, people searching, finding your site because of the content. Those are the people who are ready to take action that right then and there, right? So content's a big thing. Any other questions? I know that's kind of not a super great answer about budget, but unfortunately, there's so many variables. You can't just say, I would say 10 to 20 is what you're looking at, 10 to 20 for a very nice 50-page website. Any other questions? I got about 1 more minute. Feel free if you have any kind of questions. Thank you again so much for your time. For sure, look for that email. There's going to be a lot of useful stuff in there. Some new blog posts that aren't up yet. That strategy toolkit you can download, which is very helpful for redesigns. Links to watch this. Links to some of the tools I talked about too that are helpful for redesigns. Well, we're at time now, so if there's no other questions, last call for questions. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a great day. I hope your redesign projects go super smoothly, on time and on budget. And everyone have a great rest of your week. Thank you very much.